Now, as we come to chapter 7 almost gives a parallel to what we saw in chapter 2. You remember in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of this great image made up of 4 metals and feet mixed with iron and clay, and it depicts the 4 major kingdoms of the times of the Gentiles, beginning with the Babylonian captivity, taking us all the way into the reign of Jesus Christ, when he comes as that smiting stone, as a stone cut out of a mountain without hands, and it smites the feet of the image of the beast and shatters all the kingdoms. And it's important that we see that. It's not just smiting the feet. He smote the feet, but it crushed all the kingdoms before. And that's exactly what Revelation says. The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign in the earth. At the time when he comes, there's only going to be one world kingdom at that time. That's going to be the kingdom of Antichrist. There's only going to be one kingdom. But yet all the kingdoms, all the influence of the previous kingdoms, all of it is going to be crushed and dashed in pieces when Jesus comes. He is going to uproot every evil influence that is in this earth, and he is going to rule in righteousness when he comes. And as we think about that, we need to understand that from the very time of the fall, it has been an issue of people, men in particular, seeking to dominate other people and overtake, and in essence, take over God's creative role. Beginning with Eve in the garden. Even with Adam and Eve, we have, as a result of the fall, one of the curses placed upon the family is that contention will be in the family, because the woman's desire toward her husband is not, oh, he's Mr. Handsome, he's Mr. Hunk, he's perfect. But the desire, as we find in chapter 4, is having to do with conquering. She is going to have a natural desire within inside of her to want to rule over her husband. That is natural within. So that's why we have the women's lib movement, is because that is part of the curse. But then also, the man is going to have the same desire for his wife. And how many women have been harmed in this world because they have over-dominating husbands that manipulate and control them? This is something that began all the way back at the fall. But then even moving on forward, we have Cain, who sought dominance over Abel, his brother, and he killed him. We have the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 marrying with the daughters of men, and they took all which they chose. They didn't just marry one woman. Every woman that they liked, they married them and took wives. And the wickedness became so great in the earth as a result of that God destroyed the world. We look at the very first world dictator at the Tower of Babel, which is, in essence, from the book of Daniel. That's Babylon, is where that took place. The very first world dictator, Nimrod, who was a hunter of the souls of men. Kingdoms have warred with other kingdoms for the purpose of expansion. Each, like Nebuchadnezzar, thinking, I have built my kingdom. I have expanded this thing. This is all done by my power. But in reality, neither Nebuchadnezzar nor any other ruler before him has built his own kingdom. It is the Most High that sets up kingdoms, and he pulls them down. All the while, he is moving history. Through all these wars, through all these succeeding kingdoms, he is moving history to that time when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. Everything is moving toward that. You know, we look back and we think of the tragedies of Vietnam. We think of the tragedies going back even to World War II and then World War I. And we look at the wars previous, French and Indian War, the Revolution, all these things. War is terrible. It is a blight upon humanity. But war must happen. It is God's way of bringing all things to the final point where he comes to rule and reign. Well, we don't like it. And even this next election that's coming up, we could look at however it comes out. We can think, oh, it's terrible. The country's over. The world's going to end. But it must happen however it happens, because God is the one that is ultimately in control. That's hard to think about sometimes, isn't it? Why does God do that? Because God's working all things to bring us to that one point when Christ rules and reigns. But as we look at chapter number 7 here, chapter number 7 is going to give us a panorama of these kingdoms again. But he's going to give it to us from a different perspective. He's going to show us how these kingdoms relate to the nation of Israel. In fact, if we go over to chapter 7 and verse number 9, we see that the focus here is on Israel. In chapter 2, when we saw these kingdoms, the focus was on how this relates to the Gentile world. Here, the focus is going to be how do these kingdoms relate to national Israel. Beginning with verse number 9, I beheld till the thrones were cast down. That's talking about the kingdoms. And the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Sounds just like Revelation chapter 5. It says, the judgment was set, and the books were open, and I beheld. Then because of the voice of great words which the horn spake, I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. So right there we see where the destruction of the beast is going to come, the Antichrist, his kingdom. But then we go forward a little bit, down to verse number 13. I saw in the night visions, I beheld one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Look down to verse number 14 there. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Down to verse number 18. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom. Now, at the time that this was written, the application was about the nation of Israel, Jews that were going to believe on their Messiah when they saw him come. Shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Verse 22. Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Verse 27. And the kingdom and dominion and greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So what we're seeing is the focus of this chapter is about his kingdom. Focus of his chapter is about the reign of Jesus Christ, and particularly this is going to be an encouragement to the Jewish people because of what they're going through in Babylon. Christ is coming. That's the focus. He's going to claim all the kingdoms of the earth. He's going to rule them. And no matter how powerful the world rulers are, no matter how powerful the kings are, the leaders are, the presidents, one day, Paul tells us, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And chapter 7 is an overview of how the world is going to come to that point. Now, Daniel receives this prophecy at a very critical point in the history of the captivity. Israel has now, at this point, been in captivity for about 50 years. They've got about another 20 years to go. And the people of Israel have now begun to question God's plan for them. Is God finished with us? Is God finished with national Israel? And there's people today even that ask that same question. You look at everything that's going on over in the Middle East and with Israel, and you hear people all the time saying, just forget about Israel. And Obama almost wanted to take away our relationship with Israel, which would have been a terrible, terrible move on his part. Not that it would have differed much from any of the other moves on his part, but it would have been a really bad idea to separate from Israel. America's prosperity has nothing to do with how holy we have been, obviously. America's prosperity has everything to do with our relationship with Israel, because God says, I will bless him that blesseth thee, and I will curse him that curseth thee. And anytime a nation decides they want to turn away from national Israel, and look at what's going on in China, Anytime a nation decides they're going to turn away from Israel and become their enemy, God's judgment is going to come upon that nation. He will curse them. But even in Jeremiah's day, in Jeremiah chapter 33 and verse 24, Jeremiah comes before the Lord in prayer, and he's bringing the complaints of the people. And this is what they're saying. He's saying, "Considerest thou not what this people have spoken?" He says, "Lord, haven't you thought about what everybody's saying? All your people." They're saying, "Two families which the Lord hath chosen, Israel and Judah, he hath even cast them off." Haven't you considered that they're saying, "You've cast us off"? "Thus they have despised my people, that they should be no more a nation before them." This is what the people were saying. God's cast us off. He's done with us. All the other nations, they're destroying us so that we won't be a people anymore. Is God done with Israel? And to which God replies in verse 25, "Thus saith the Lord, if my covenant be not with day and night, and if I have not appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth, then will I cast away the seed of Jacob and David my servant, so that I will not take any of his seed to be rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For I will cause their captivity to return and have mercy on them." He says, if the day and night perish, he says, if the ordinances of heaven and the order of heaven that's out there, if all that passes away, then my covenant will be done. If I haven't created it to last, then my covenant will be done. But as long as the heaven and earth stand, as long as the sun is still there, as long as the moon is still there, God's covenant with Israel stands, and they will return, and he will have mercy on them. Now, what we see in chapters 7 through 12, chapter 7 picks up kind of a new section of the book of Daniel. It's going to be primarily prophetic. We're not so much looking into what Daniel went through or Daniel's three friends went through or kind of the personal events of his life. But now we're looking primarily at a prophetic section of Scripture. And chapter 7 through 12 zero in on how God is going to fulfill his promise with the nation of Israel. And this is a particularly important time for this prophecy to come, because this is the first year now of Belshazzar's reign. Remember, we're stepping back in history. Remember, back in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar has this big golden idol set up in the desert. And everybody's commanded to worship. But after that whole incident, Nebuchadnezzar, after the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar reaches a point where he realizes that the God of heaven is the one that's in charge. God is the one that is ruling. And everybody is to give reverence and respect to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And from that point on, even though Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the greatest guy or necessarily a moral guy or a religious guy as far as we would think, from that point forward until the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, things weren't so bad anymore for the people of Israel. They kind of got a little bit more freedom. They didn't have to bow down to the golden image. They didn't have to bow down anymore because Nebuchadnezzar realized, hey, there's a higher power here that's a little bit more powerful than I am. And so so things weren't so bad. But now, by this point, Nebuchadnezzar is dead. Now his grandson, Belshazzar, is reigning in his stead, and he is an evil man, and he has no regard whatsoever for God, and he has no regard for his people. And so God gives Daniel this vision about how they're going to come to the end of their captivity. And the way he does this is he does it by showing how these kingdoms are going to succeed one another, that this kingdom is almost over. God is showing the people. He's given Daniel this vision. Daniel's going to tell it to the people to encourage them. God is not done with Israel. Israel is going to go back to the land. Their Messiah is going to come. But these are some things that have to take place before he comes for us. So now notice over in chapter 7, beginning with verse number 1, we're going to look at the great beast. There's really kind of a breakdown that we could have of this chapter. We could break it down, the great beast, the great judgment, referring to the Antichrist and the judgment that comes upon him, and then the great kingdom of Messiah. That's kind of the focus. So today we're just going to look at the great beast and try to get through this. And as I said, this parallels chapter 2, but it's taken from a different perspective. And so this is what we need to see. In verse number 1, it says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed, that he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters." So up to this point, when the visions came, it was always to other people. It was Nebuchadnezzar that had the dream about the great image. It was Nebuchadnezzar that had the dream about the great tree. None of it was personal towards Daniel, but now in chapter 7, Daniel is receiving a vision. And this is a vision that is meant to go to the people of Israel. So that's why Daniel's getting this. I always had a problem with that. Well, if he already told us in chapter 2 what the history was going to be, why is he repeating it in chapter 7? Well, it's because in chapter 2, it was for Nebuchadnezzar to realize that his kingdom was not going to last forever. It was for the Gentiles to understand, look, somebody else is in control here. But when we come to chapter 7, the emphasis is for Daniel to tell his people, God is still in control, he's not done, and he's going to bring about his kingdom, and he's going to give it to the saints of the Most High. He's going to give it back to Israel. That's the point. And I want you to notice too there, it says that he had a dream, singular, and visions, plural. And that's important to understand. Probably most of us have had something like that happen to us. You ever have a dream, and it's a terrible dream, and then you wake up, or you think you wake up, but you're just in another dream, and it's kind of like you're in a dream within a dream, and that dream's even worse. I remember one time, this has nothing to do with it, but one time when I was a kid, I had this dream that I was at my grandparents' house. No, I was having a bad dream, and then I woke up at my grandparents' house. Or I thought I woke up at my grandparents' house, but I was just in another dream. And I woke up on the couch, and I looked toward the hallway, and there's this giant eyeball that's floating down the hallway, and it looks at me. And I realized at that moment, I'm in another dream. I need to get out of this thing. But that has nothing to do with this. But that's kind of what's going on here with Daniel. Daniel is having a dream, but there's multiple visions that take place within inside of this dream. So he's kind of going from one dream into another dream into another dream. So it's one dream, successive visions. Then beginning in verse number 8 on, it's one continuous vision that he's going to have. Sorry, carbohydrates from lunch is getting to me. But not only did he write this dream, he has this dream and he writes it down, but it says that he told the sum of the matters. He told this to the people. This was a declaration for them, for those that were in captivity at Babylon, a reminder that God is still on the throne and that he keeps his promises. This is something that Nebuchadnezzar had already learned. Belshazzar is about to learn this because in about 20 years, the Medo-Persian Empire is going to come in under Cyrus, and they're going to get rid of Babylon. Belshazzar is going to be killed. And they're going to find out that the Most High does indeed rule in the kingdom of men. Right now, God's kind of giving man his chance to run things. And I don't think he's doing a very good job at it. But he has his chance. God's kind of giving Satan the run of things, to influence, to kind of prove himself and show how powerful he is, and I guess kind of let him think that he can overthrow God. But one day that's all going to come to an end because Christ is going to come and he's going to overthrow all the kingdoms. Let's get into this prophecy some. So verse number 2, it says, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. Now, the great sea is a reference to the Mediterranean, but one of the things that we see throughout Scripture is when you see a great sea, especially in prophecy, it is a picture of the masses of humanity. For instance, Isaiah chapter 17, verse 12. Woe to the multitude of many people which make a noise like the noise of the seas, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 1, John is standing upon the sand of the sea, says, and he saw coming up out of the sea a beast having 7 heads and 10 horns. In Revelation chapter 17 and verse 15, he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the horse sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So what is being depicted here in kind of a prophetic imagery, Daniel sees the sea, but it is a depiction of the masses of humanity, and what is going on over top of the masses of humanity is the 4 winds of heaven are striving together. Now, you can imagine what happens when you get couples systems of wind going opposite direction, going together on the sea. What happens? You have very troubled water. It just goes all over the place. It's roaring. You have waves raging, and that's exactly what Daniel is seeing. He's depicting God's judgment over the nations. In Jeremiah 49, verse 36, God speaks of these 4 winds. Upon Elam will I bring the 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven, and will scatter them toward those winds. So these 4 winds are a picture of God's judgment, and how God is going to come in and scatter the nations. It's in Revelation chapter 7 and verses 1 to 3, we see that these 4 winds are controlled by 4 angels, and these 4 winds are designed specifically to hurt the earth. It's a picture of God's judgment, of God's wrath. And so these 4 winds are striving upon the great sea. He's depicting humanity in turmoil. He's depicting humanity under God's judgment. Did you know that if man had not fallen, there would be no need for world government, for human government? Because it has been God's plan from the very beginning to rule over His people. That was the plan. But then when man fell, then it became necessary, especially after the flood. That's why God instituted human government at the time of the flood, is because man has fallen. Man needs somebody there to rule over him and keep him in check. So human government is actually, in a sense, a curse, part of the curse upon humanity. And boy, don't we see that. But it is this chaos and turmoil that Daniel sees happening out on the sea. It is from this that these kingdoms are going to arise. From the masses of humanity, from the turmoil in over all the world, kingdoms are going to arise and try to establish their dominance and try to subdue the people of earth. Verse 3, we see the first thing coming. He says, the 4 beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. And so we see that these beasts are going to come up from the sea. So that kind of gives us an indication that this isn't literal water. Because these kingdoms, as Daniel's going to explain here, these beasts are kingdoms coming up, and kingdoms don't arise from literal water. But out of this turmoil of human history, 4 superpowers are going to arise. They will be great and massive. They're going to be monstrous. And that depicts the character that they have. So what we see here in chapter 2, when we see these kingdoms, it was the kingdoms being depicted from man's perspective. And when man looks at the human government and the kingdoms of this world, they can look at it and be wowed by it. And that's exactly how Nebuchadnezzar saw it. Head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron. And that's pretty impressive to look at. And that's really kind of a beautiful image to look at. Something you might even set up in your garden to take for people to look at as they drive by. But that is not at all the way God sees human government. So those very same kingdoms, depicted by gold, silver, brass, and iron, God sees them as vicious, ravening monsters. That's how God views the kingdoms of this world. That's what Daniel is showing us here. And so the first one we see in verse number 4. Now remember, each one of these comes successively. They don't all 4 come out of the sea at once. And so the first, he says, verse 4, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given unto it. So this first one is Babylon. We know that because throughout the Scripture, both Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk all refer to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar as being a lion and an eagle. Both are being used to refer to Babylon. The lion was a symbol of Babylon in Nebuchadnezzar's day because the lion is the king of the beast. It's ferocious. It's powerful. It was something that, we look at the American eagle as being a symbol of pride. Did you know that initially Benjamin Franklin had the idea of making the turkey the national bird? Could you imagine that? I have turkeys. That would be embarrassing. Going into war with a standard, you have a turkey. And that'd be worse than being called a Yank. You're a bunch of turkeys is what you are. That'd be embarrassing. But an eagle, now that's powerful. There's something prideful about seeing an eagle as it flies through the sky. Nothing graceful or prideful at all about watching a turkey try to fly. So the lion was a symbol of power for Babylon. And it had eagle's wings because it was a symbol. It's the most powerful among the birds. But what we see here is these wings are going to be plucked off, or they were plucked off from this lion. It depicts the humiliation that Nebuchadnezzar went through for those 7 years, where he was changed into a beast, and the heart of an animal was given to him instead of the heart of a man. But then after those 7 years, he received a man's heart. He was placed back on the throne. He stood upon his feet once again, and man's heart was given to him. He was changed back. But then we go to the next beast. This is something that at this time, when Daniel was writing this has not happened yet. With Nebuchadnezzar, that had happened with the lion. But right now, technically, as where we're at in Daniel, the lion is still in charge. But now there's another beast that's going to come. And he says, verse number 5, and behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said unto it, now this is key here. They said unto it, arise, devour much flesh. Now this is a picture of Medo-Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire that comes in right after Nebuchadnezzar, after Belshazzar is killed. And so the chronology of chapter 7 goes backwards in history a little bit. Verse 4 has already happened. Verse 5 is about to happen in about 20 years. And we talked about that not too long ago. But the bear refers to the power and the fierceness of the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel sees it up on one side, so 2 legs are up in the air on its side. And it shows that the instability of power, because you remember, the Medo-Persian Empire is not technically one empire. It's 2 empires that have merged together and brought the power of 2 empires together. So there's technically kind of like 2 kings trying to rule. And while the Persians were more powerful than the Medes, while the Median Empire was greater in mass and size and extent, the Persians were actually more powerful and influential in that kingdom. So it was an instability of powers. One kingdom was more powerful than the other. But then he also mentions the 3 ribs that are in his mouth, between his teeth, and it indicates the area that they conquered, because the Medo-Persian Empire expanded beyond the territory that Babylon had initially had. They had conquered Babylon, that's one of them, but then they also went as far south into Egypt, and they conquered northwest into Lydia, which is modern-day Turkey. So they've expanded the kingdom from where it was in 3 different directions. And then also note that he says, they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. You know what's really important to understand about that? Why that's there? Is because it indicates not only is this new kingdom going to be greater because it's going to devour much flesh, but it operates under the authority of another. It had to be told to devour much flesh. It didn't do it on its own. And this is key because this indicates God's purpose. Remember, this empire, the Medo-Persians, as they come in and conquer Babylon, they are led by Cyrus. And this is what Isaiah 45:1 says about Cyrus. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, notice this, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Also in Ezra chapter 1, Cyrus himself says, the Lord charged me. See, Cyrus even acknowledged the fact he was not operating under his own authority. God commanded him to do so. So when it says, arise, devour much flesh, we're seeing this next kingdom that comes in, this is God ordained. God is moving the kingdoms toward this final event. In verse number 6, we see the third kingdom. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So hopefully by now you're getting the picture that these are not real creatures that he's seeing. These are symbolic. Lions don't have wings. At least I've never seen one with an actual wing before. Leopards only have 1 head. They don't have 4. Even if it's a mutation, maybe he has a second head, and they certainly don't have 4 wings that work. So this beast has 4 heads, has 4 wings, and this is a prophecy that is looking forward hundreds of years from the time of Daniel. It's looking forward hundreds of years to the time when Alexander the Great is going to conquer essentially the known world. The leopard speaks of his fierceness, it speaks of his speed, and there's not 2 wings as of a lion, but there are the 4 wings that are put upon it. Now, leopards are fast as it is. They're fast animals, but imagine adding 4 wings to it. You're going to have all the more speed. And this depicts Alexander the Great's conquest of the known world. In fact, in chapter 8, we're going to see this again with Alexander the Great, where he's depicted as a goat that is moving so fast that he does not even touch the ground when he moves because he's going so fast. But as Alexander the Great conquered, he conquered all the way from not only the Medo-Persian Empire, but he went as far north and west as Europe, conquering most of Europe, all the way over into India by the time he was 33 years of age. Younger than I am. I can't imagine. Most people, if they're conquering anything, they spend their lifetime trying to do this. He's only 33 years old, and he has conquered most of the world. In fact, he even reached a point where he falls down on his bed sobbing because there's no more worlds to conquer just before he dies. And he's just upset that it's like, I've done everything, and there's nothing left. But then at his death, and this is what we see here with the 4 heads, what they depict. At his death, his kingdom is divided between 4 of his generals. Cassander gets Grecia and Macedonia. Lysimachus gets Thrace and Asia Minor. Seleucus gets Syria and the Middle East. And Ptolemy gets Egypt. So that's why he's depicted with 4 heads. And it's really interesting as you look at these prophecies. And this is what has brought the greatest amount of criticism to the book of Daniel, is because the prophecies are so specific and so accurate, hundreds of years before they ever happened. The critics would say, there's no way Daniel was written way back during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. It had to have been written sometime after Christ came because it's just so detailed and so specific, and there's no way anybody could know that stuff. And they're right. Nobody could know that stuff except for the one who is moving all of history on to one event. The one who controls everything, he's the one that's telling Daniel all this. And then notice the 4th kingdom here, verse number 7. After this I saw in the night visions, behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, this one's not like anything that he's ever seen before. In fact, he can't even describe it as a regular animal. And this isn't like a lion. This isn't like a bear. This isn't like a leopard. This is just an exceeding great beast. It's dreadful and terrible. Just the sight of it drives fear into people. It's ferocious and frightening. But the iron that is seen there in his teeth give it away that this is Rome. And as it's following right along with chapter 2, and we saw that the iron was a picture of Rome. Now, we don't know exactly what it looks like. He doesn't really explain it, but I think if we turn over to Revelation 13 real quick, we get my speculation, because of the parallel between Daniel and Revelation, is that this beast looked just like the beast that John sees in Revelation chapter 13. He says, verse 1, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy. And the beast that I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wandered after the beast. This, I think, really is exactly what Daniel is saying. He just didn't know how to describe it. It's kind of a hodgepodge of all the previous kingdoms, because that's exactly what happened. As each kingdom succeeded, they absorbed into them the kingdoms previous. They absorbed as much as they could. You see, here in verse 19, in Daniel chapter number 7, verse 19, it says that the beast stamped the residue. Well, there in verse number 7, stamped the residue. In 19, he has nails of brass, which indicate judgment. So he crushes everything in his way. That's what Rome was known for doing. See, the previous kingdoms, you look at Persia, you look at Greece, they tried to absorb into their culture the cultures of the people that they conquered. As much as they could bring in and still keep peace, they would bring it in. But not Rome. When Rome came in, it dashed everybody in pieces. It forced religion. It forced politics. It forced beliefs and customs upon the people. And it's really interesting with Rome that Rome lasted longer than any of the other kingdoms. Rome lasted over 1,500 years until 1450 A.D. So it's not been that long ago since Rome fell. And so we can look at that and say, well, if that was the last kingdom before Christ returns, then why hasn't Christ returned yet? That's a logical question. But if we notice in verse number 7, at the end there, it says that he has 10 horns. Those are the 10 kings. That's the 10 toes from chapter 2. That hasn't happened yet. At no point has Rome been divided into 10 segments that are on earth simultaneously. And I would also suggest that Rome only fell politically. In 1450, when Rome fell, it only fell politically. It did not fall religiously. I'm convinced that the Roman Catholic Church has continued this Roman system until today, and it will continue through Mystery Babylon the Great in Revelation until Christ comes. The Roman Empire is still in existence, just in a different form. So it has not gone away yet. It has continued on. We'll see a revival of the Roman Empire. We'll see that in Revelation chapter 13 and Revelation chapter 17. And it's going to be a visible reinstatement of power. See, right now, the Roman Empire is just kind of being carried along by this religious system. It's kind of not in control in a visible form, although the Catholic Church has far more control than we give it credit for and than most people realize. But there's going to come a time where they are going to receive the power that they once had in the Middle Ages. We may not see that happen, but it's going to happen. And that's where the Antichrist is going to come from. We see that in Revelation chapter 17. That she's going to kill the saints. She's going to be drunk with the blood of saints. The kings of this world are going to commit fornication with her. She is going to be in charge. But what we see here is that right after this, What Daniel is going to show is that right after this, Christ is going to come in his kingdom. All of the world kingdoms, all forms of human government are going to come to an end. And the message Daniel gives to these people, these downtrodden captives, now that this Belshazzar is reigning, and he's an evil man, and he's subduing the people once again, they need encouragement. And what he tells them is he gives them hope that God is not through. Despite the kingdoms that are going to come, God is not through with Israel, and he's not through with us either. And we're going to face some times here before Christ comes that we're going to wonder, where are you? We kind of even wonder that sometimes now. Are you going to do anything about this? He most certainly is going to do something about it. He is going to come. He's going to right all the wrongs. But there is going to be toil and turbulence until he comes. Rulers are going to come and go. There's going to be turbulence for the saints. But Christ will come. He's going to subdue all kingdoms, and he's going to subdue all power. He's going to right all the wrongs, and he is going to reign supreme on this earth until all the end of time. All the influence of all the kingdoms of the world is going to be uprooted, dashed to pieces, and Christ is going to rule in righteousness from the throne of David.